Welcome back to the boathouse. This week it's time to get started on the shrouds for Arabella's standing rigging. Steve has selected galvanized wire that will be parceled and served. Stay tuned to find out what all that means. But first, the final round shape and taper gets put into the mainmast. With the mainmast all glued up, Keith's next task was to get it as close to cylindrical as possible, and to put in the taper at the top to match the mizzenmast. To see how those measurements were taken from the curve of a circle, check back to episode 160. The link is in the description. To get from a square to a circle, Keith first used 3 sizes of circular saws to make a close to perfect square, and then an octagon, eventually increasing the number of facets to 32 and sanding from that point on.
So this one picks up much more than dust, I would call this. These are like little shavings practically.
Yep.
And so the idea is that now we do another pass, another pass. This drops down another 2 inches and can go. So there's one pass with a little worm drive, one pass with a bigger worm drive, and then one pass with 2 passes with this guy.
4, 5, 3 passes with this, 1 with each of the other ones. So 5 passes total, and then 8 of these cuts. So it's whatever that is, that 30 passes.
Outside, Steve was sorting through Victoria's old spars to figure out what to send back to Vermont with Keith. But not all of these will make it onto Arabella.
A tree fell on it when it was on the hard one year.
Oh, okay.
And snapped it off. So you can see the glue line here. But this section here is like one big unmolested chunk of Douglas fir. So I might see what's usable there. And it won't become a spar, but
Just something.
who knows?
Yeah. Who knows?
Well, we get trees, all of them, and the whole mizzen setup will be from Victoria.
The whole mizzen setup will be from Victoria. What a gift. You're just transferring that shape to each side, right? Like as your
Just
reference.
walking it around because I just finished this side, so I got to put it back where it belongs.
Right. Okay, cool.
Yeah. It worked. So, if I squared it correctly, then this dimension here should be the same as that dimension, right? And then if I octagoned it correctly, then, you know, this dimension here and that dimension there should be the same, and they should be the same as here, which I've got. So it's within reason. A couple places it's off by, you know, maybe a 16th or so. In order to get the octagon, I use this thing, which has a ratio. It's actually not set up properly anymore, but the ratio on this is what I actually used, was these holes, and it was 7, 10, 7. This one is 1, 2, 1, and that'll give a 16 size. This is only going to work on the straight part, and I'll have to mess around with the tapered part because this thing would need to, I'll have to make this thing skinny or something to make it actually work. When it starts to taper, it wants to do that, but most of it's straight, so I'll start there.
KP was working on the housetop, putting some decorative grooves into the interior side before finishing up with the last coats of paint. And downstairs, Steve fired up the bandsaw to see what was inside Victoria's old Douglas fir bowsprit.
Too much power going on.
Grain on that. Grain is so beautiful.
So because I first shaped the 4 sides of the spar as a square really carefully, I knew that I had those as a guideline to reference other sides off of. And I was able to get the 8 sides very accurately and have 8 equal faces. And then when I did the 32 faces, they were also quite equal. So knowing that, I did measure them as I went down the spar, and I kept the individual lines equal. That kind of double checks that the dimensions are good. And then at some point I started taking only long passes. So once I got it to like 8 facets, I started taking full length passes. So I didn't have any sort of dips and hills going. So I knew that I had it fairly accurately. I did double check it a little bit with the big calipers. And then from the 32 sides, I had little ridges, 32 ridges. So in order to take those down, I've been taking this rigid longboard with a pretty rough grit on it. And if I bridge several of those facets, you can start to feel it round really, really quickly. Once I've got it fairly round, but I can still feel those ridges subtly, because your hand will tell you more than your eye, almost always. Then I made this longboard that I made sure that the one section of the mast was really smooth, and I used that as my jig to make this curve. So I know that I have this curve at least, which is most of the mast, which is identical to the real curve of the mast. And then this one, I do like a fairing stroke, so I come like a helix around the spar. Same thing as the other one. So I'll go all the way up, in one direction, and then I'll come back and that makes sort of a helix this way and a helix that way, and then you can really start to feel it. It's like the proof is just by touching it. And then I'll do it again, and again, and again, over and over again down the entire length of the mast, never camping out on one spot. And then I rotate it, and I go again and again for, I don't know, I've been at it for a half a day, I think. I left one facet from my 16 sides flat. I didn't want to fair it in round, because this is where the track will go for the gaff. We want it to be as flat as possible for as long as possible until we find out exactly how wide that track is. And then that could be faired in a little bit more, but it's flat, and that's how we want it.
So with the mainmast done for now, Anne loaded up her car with Keith and the spars that he'd be working on over the winter and took him back to Vermont. And this is just a shot of Anne's cool bumper sticker collection on her very aerodynamic vehicle.
We're starting to work on the rigging for Arabella, and there's a lot of decisions that need to be made in the rig. So we spend a lot of time talking to folks and doing research and weighing pros and cons about what material to use for the rigging. Because believe it or not, there's a number of choices, and they all work, and they all work well, but they all have their quirks and the things that they do well and the things that they don't do well. So we have kind of a pros and cons list here. So these are our main options for rigging. We can use stainless wire, which is pretty ubiquitous these days. We can use galvanized, which you don't see as often. We can use modern fibers, which are making more and more inroads every day. Or there's solid rod. Now, solid rod for Arabella is not applicable. We can't do it in-house. It's very expensive. There's no point whatsoever in putting it on a gaff rig sailboat. It has no business being on Arabella. It's a great material for a very different boat. Stainless, galvanized, and modern fibers all would work. They would all work well. But like I said, each of them have our quirks. So we ruled out modern fibers first. And the reason we took out modern fibers is three big ones, really. They don't give, chafe is an issue, and UV damage. So they are, depending on what fiber you use, varying levels of UV resistance, but nowhere near as resistant to UV as stainless or galvanized. And you can serve them and protect them from chafe, but yet again, nowhere near a wire. And you size modern fibers not for their strength, but by their creep, by how much they're going to stretch. So they are tremendously stronger than they need to be for their purpose, because you're sizing them for that stretch. And what happens on a gaff rig boat where you have low tensions and you're not pulling the shrouds down super tight is things do have a little bit of give to them. And the fact that there's really no give whatsoever in modern fibers actually would not be good for the wood spars and for how the gaff rig is set up. So although it would work for a voyaging boat, chafe with the gaff rig is a bit of an issue. You do have to be concerned about UV damage. But otherwise, it's light, it's strong, it's easy to work, it's great. So that really left us with stainless and galvanized. And one of the big things that pushed us over to galvanized over stainless is the fact that we have wooden spars. Stainless, it wants air, so it wants to be exposed for it to not corrode. Galvanized wants to be covered. Stainless, if you splice eyes into it, the eyes can work harden and break, and they work harden a lot less than galvanized, like way less. So for a wooden spar, that makes a big difference, because how we attach those wires to the mast, I want to do them with Eyesplices. So if we look over here, this is what we talk about with Eyesplice. So this is in rope instead of wire, but it's the same exact principle. The rope gets brought around, you untwist, unravel all of the ends, and they get neatly laced back and through. So it's a little bit different in these modern fibers, but that's what a spliced eye would look like. And here we have some stainless rigging, and this is put in with pressure fittings. So you need a special tool for this. And the wire gets put in, and this gets crushed under tremendous pressure so that it grips the wire. So if you have an aluminum mast, this makes a lot of sense, because on your aluminum mast, you'll have tangs that are attached to it. And as you can see, it's really easy to put one of these fittings on, slide your tang in, put a bolt in, or have a fitting with a hole in it and put on a shackle. They're really, really easy to connect to those metal fittings. Now, one that you don't see very often these days is, I think they're spalted, if I remember, spelted pockets. Spelter sockets, that's it. There's a metal that's poured in. So you put the wire through, untwist the wire, fray it all out, pull it back into this big socket, and then fill it full of liquid metal. And that's what holds these on. You don't see these very much these days. But since we have wooden masts, we need to find a way to attach these wires to the mast. Now, the problem with wood is getting that attachment point strong enough. So we have, these metal bands. This is how Victorias were done. And those would go around the mast. Obviously, they would fit tighter. And as you pull down on one side of this, you can see that this bottom edge is pulling away and this top edge is riding on the mast. And from the mast, slowly moving around the tiny little bit it moves over however many millions of gyrations, it ends up creating a groove in the mast, which breaks through the finish and causes an area of rot, and that can be an issue. So you need pretty wide bands. They need to be attached really well. But what's even simpler is to just take an Eyesplice, throw it over the end of the mast, and you just need something to keep it from coming down. So you can make hounds like this out of metal, or you can make them out of wood. And that would just go on the back of the mast here. That wire, it wouldn't be line. Well, it could be line if you're doing it out of synthetic fibers. And that just keeps it from falling down. So you have a couple holes in the mast that are holding that plate on, or that would hold that wooden one on if you did it out of wood. but it's a lot less, it's a lot more surface area. So it's distributing that load a lot better. The mast is captured on both sides, one shroud going one way, one going the other. So if you have a wooden mast, Eyesplices are a great way to go. And you also have no more connections. So here you would have the bolt that goes through, you would have the shackle or the pin that goes on. Any one of those is open to failure. Where a spliced eye, the only way for that to fail is for it to break. So here we have some brand new galvanized wire. And it is really nice and shiny because it's zinc coated, which is what galvanizing is. And that zinc coating will not last forever. In fact, it really won't last all that terribly long on the outside. The issue with galvanized is rust. And it rusts quickly, it rusts profusely, and you end up with a big mess. And that is where parceling and serving comes in. The steps for parceling and serving are, first, we wipe it down with lanolin. If you're not familiar with lanolin, that is what sheep make, so that their wool becomes water repellent and nice and supple. Over the lanolin goes friction tape. So this isn't your plastic electrical tape. This is true friction tape, and it is impregnated cotton. So it's actually fabric. You can hear it when you rip it, and it's sticky on both sides. The friction tape wants to go on the same direction as the lay of the wire, so following the same spiral of the wire. And the friction tape determines which end of the wire goes up and which end of the wire goes down, because you want the friction tape to act like a series of shingles. So it should overlap the layer below it about halfway, and think about it like the shingles on your roof. You want the water to run from one shingle onto the next and not underneath them. So the friction tape is the same, and that designates what is the top and what is the bottom of your shroud.
That's it, right there.
Very nice, as though it was planned.
That's layer number 2 of protection. Layer number 3 is some sort of tarred, seine twine, nylon. There's a bunch of different options that you can use. But essentially, that you can do it by hand, but with a serving mallet is much better. So this is a serving mallet, and they come in a bunch of iterations, but the idea is the same. This twine just gets wrapped around the handle and around the head so that it creates friction. And as this gets spun, there's enough friction that this wraps it nice and tight, but not so much that it's too tight or it breaks. And that really just depends on how much friction you have in the spool and how many wraps and where you have the wraps. And it took us a little while to get that figured out for us in our system. But they're pretty simple, ingenious little things. The double nuts were very important. We found that as the spool rotated, it would tighten or loosen. And by cranking the 2 nuts tightly against each other, we keep the distance. And same thing with having the spring to keep some tension. And then the final layer is some sort of slush. So linseed oil and Stockholm tar. We're going to use commercial made net dip, which is made to go on synthetic fibers like this. It'll make that brown a very nice black. It's easy to put on. It won't come off on your hands like the Stockholm tar will, so you won't be tracking it around as much. So our next step for these is to chauffeur them down to Becca Buckler, who is going to do the rigging. So Becca Buckler runs Reef Point Rigging. And what she is going to do is undo some of our serving and splicing where she needs to, form the eye, and that way the inside of the eye is already parceled and served. It's a lot easier to do it now than when it's in a loop. And then she'll put the serving in, or she'll put the splicing in, and she'll serve over where she opened up for the splice. And then when we get them back, we will put the water-based net dip on them, which will be their last coat of protection, and turn them all black, and then they'll be ready to go on the boat in under 7 months. So I'm dropping off the shrouds here with Becca, who's going to do all the wire splicing. Wire splicing is correct me if I'm wrong here, not terribly difficult, but there's a lot of technique to it, and it takes a lot of practice to be able to efficiently make wire splices.
Yeah, that's a good description. It's kind of the opposite of splicing rope.
Okay.
It's with the lay instead of against the lay. And you need tools to get in there to open up the strands, but yeah, with some practice, it's not so hard.
So how long have you been rigging? How'd you get into it?
I got my start with rigging the Oliver Hazard Perry when it was under construction in 2014.
Okay.
So what's that, 8 years? And then from there I went on to work at the San Francisco Maritime Museum, Mystic Seaport, Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum. It's a skill that isn't so common, so gets you around. And then I started my own business in 2018, think about that, Reef Point Rigging, where I've just been freelancing, doing this kind of work from home when somebody's got some shrouds for me to take and splice at home, or traveling to wherever I'm needed, wherever there's a tall ship or a classic yacht that needs some splices.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, I'm super happy to be having you. This is great to put these in the hands of a professional, and I'm sure they're going to be way nicer and neater and a lot quicker than if we were to try to do them. So
and I'm
really
happy to have
appreciate
a little work for the winter.
Perfect. Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Becca. And
Thank you.
yeah, let me know if you have any questions or issues, and yeah, give me a holler when you haven't finished.
Sounds good. We'll see you in the
Perfect.
spring.
Awesome.
And the saw handled the. That should have made me jump out of my skin on a normal day. Messages getting sent from.
Hello down there.
Why, hello, stranger.
This is like early walkie-talkie.
Yeah, you just need your mile of Smurf tubing.
This stuff works very well if you amplify one's voice.